Josh Raven here with the Daily Dot at DreamHack Masters Malmö, joined by Thorin of the analysis desk, of course. And I guess we'll just jump right into the tournament, starting in the group stage that happened in the week. And I kind of want to start with a team that you often complain about a little bit on Twitter, a team that's very close to your heart, Astralis, obviously, who didn't make it out of the group, losing to NIP. What did you make of them in this tournament, and why do you think they were unable to kind of make it out?
Well, first of all, I've got to give credit to someone who made a Reddit comment that I thought was really quite pithy, quite funny, and what he said was that since he heard that the Astralis players' families had bought tickets to come to the arena, then the only way Astralis could keep up their long tradition of actually disappointing those who love them was to go out in the group stages this time, whereas normally they always get out the group stages. It's normally like a deep series late in the tournament where you have to worry about them. I mean, you just look at the whole tournament, it was a disaster. They got to play against Dignitas in the winners game. That should be easy money for them because they always beat Dignitas, and usually Dignitas are the ones who are a bit nervous playing against kind of the bigger brother team who have all the best players in Denmark. So that was a bad sign when they lost that immediately. And then in the actual series, I mean, it's like I actually kind of set it up almost. I almost had the omen when I was doing the analysis before the match. I said, okay, so on paper, Astralis is a much better team than NIP right now. NIP has a lot to prove with a new player, but somehow when you get those legendary type lineup teams in a big match, it feels like form actually kind of goes out the window, and they're going to play so many rounds that you're just going to see the essence of who the teams are. And so you saw it in this match. I think Astralis have better players, but aside from Device, who actually this time was the one who didn't choke, people like Dupree just non-existent in a couple of the maps. Meanwhile, over on the NIP side, some of the players who were very quiet recently, people like Exist, obviously Pitt, were coming up with really big kills, really big clutch moments, and so it was the essence of both teams. NIP are always clutch, and they're always going to kind of keep you honest, whereas Astralis, unfortunately, they get into positions where you feel like they can win, and somehow they find a way not to win. So disappointing for Astralis overall, but I mean, it's who they are at this point. You have to just accept that.
And what do you think they can do, Astralis, to kind of fix that? Is there anything? Obviously, it's been going on for so long now. Obviously, usually further on in the tournament, but at this point, what do they even do to kind of change this and finally maybe win something?
I actually had a little back and forth with Device about this on Twitter recently, where I actually suggested, bearing in mind Astralis have their own org now, and they have all this financial backing. I mean, we heard this, they even said themselves they get paid $9,000 a month salary each. So when you're talking about this sort of money, and you can win $500,000 for winning the major, and they're a team who should on paper be capable of that, if I were them, I would invest in a top level, sports psychology trainer, or actually just some sort of therapist. Maybe it's not even about the game. Maybe you just need someone to work out whatever kind of issues these people have when they're under pressure. I mean, in a sense, okay, the reason why there was a back and forth is Device was no, I have read some books on this topic, and I think in the past he said he'd seen someone, but my qualms is whether it's just a local person who's just someone he knows, or whether they're getting high level help. Because you have to realize this stuff happens actually for world class athletes. People obviously, a good example would be Andy Murray. He's been in all these finals of the Australian Open, he's never won one. So he's obviously fantastic, because he gets there again and again and again, but something's stopping him winning whatever it is mentally, can't perform up to his level. So the kind of people who deal with those guys and who can get them over the hump, understandably their services are highly in demand, and so it'll cost a lot of money, but it's not outrageous. You could get one of these people, even if it's just a month, to work with the guy. I think another option now actually presented itself in this tournament. So Dignitas themselves, they're not as good a team, so they shouldn't necessarily always win, but they played very poorly against EnVyUs. But one guy in that team played amazingly, which was Kjaerbye. Actually played, he was very, very rock solid. He didn't seem to get phased out by his team playing so poorly. So I mean, bearing in mind they've stuck with that same five-man core in Astralis for so long, and they only won a few tournaments last year, and it's been a while since they won one. Eventually you have to ask, is it a roster move? Now, if it's going to be a roster move, I think that's the obvious person to pick up, because he's got a lot of skill, he's overcome his own issues, and now he's not choking under pressure. So if there's one sort of player you need in Astralis, you look at how many fantastic players they've got, you'd say a player who isn't going to let the nerves get to him. So I can't be certain if that would be the case, but it's got to at least be on their radar, I think.
And who do you think would be the one, if that theoretical roster change would happen, which player do you think would be the one that they should look to, or could look to replace, if anything? I
mean, on both a social aspect and in terms of the role that they should play, I think it probably should actually be cajunB, because I've noticed, I don't think Cajun, I always differentiate between tilt and choke. To me, cajunB is a tilter. What he does is he gets really angry at himself when he's playing badly. Some of the Na'Vi players do this, whereas people like Device and Dupree, we have seen them choke. They actually seem paralyzed by the moment, and they can't kill people. They destroy themselves in a way. So the problem is, you can't really take Device out, because first of all, he was very good here, even in the loss. He is the best player overall, so you have to kind of double down on that and hope that he's just going to get over the problems, because if he ever does, it's going to be like EnVyUs when they just came around out of nowhere this time. He's going to be fantastic. Then Dupree, okay, he played badly here, but he was the guy who destroyed Fnatic. And crucially, Dupree and Device are the ones who've been in the team the whole time. So I feel like like just the social dynamic there, they're not going to break up. They're not going to like let each other go. So Cajun was the last one to rejoin the team in theory. He's had problems in the past where because of like lack of motivation or in theory like personality clashes, they removed him in the past. And so since he's the guy where he's not really doing that great at the moment. I mean, his map was Dust 2 and that's the one they're not so good at. I just feel like it's the only logical option because you have to have Carrigan, he's the in-game leader. You can't really kick him out unless maybe he was willing to go to a coach role. I'm not so sure about that. And then I don't feel like he can kick Zibnix out because, I mean, it's not really his fault if his stars don't perform. His job's to be a support player. So the obvious choice to me is probably KGB. I mean, he won't like to hear that, but that's what happens.
Well, it's kind of a tough situation, yeah, but let's look towards some of the other teams, perhaps some of the other kind of bigger teams in the tournament that are kind of doing surprisingly well, right? You've got EnVyUs, they just made it through to the semi-final. NiP beating Astralis and Virtus Pro as well, coming up pretty big. Which one of those kind of teams do you think, okay, maybe we should word it this way, why do you think these teams are now coming back into shape after having such a kind of bad showing in the last few months and towards the end of 2015?
The only one that's like a surprise to me is the EnVyUs one. And in as much as, what's funny is, if you went back and tracked all the series I've been predicting for the last few months, like EnVyUs is basically bankrupting me because I'm predicting them all the time to win. Funnily enough, one of the only times I didn't predict them to win was Tempo Storm, and then Tempo Storm of course lost and EnVyUs won. So the reason why though is because at the time I kept thinking like when I looked at the roster on paper every time, I was like, this doesn't make sense that this team can lose so often. Like they should be able to beat these teams, and for the same reasons as they did here. Not because they've turned it around, they've got a brilliant, fantastic meta game. Just because when you look at that level of talent, you're like, it only needs like 2 people here to have a good game and you can win the match. Now, inconceivably, they had a whole run of months where like they never had 2 people in a game have a really good match. Like Kenny S had an amazing performance at Counter Pit against Nanaji, and everyone else just essentially like shit the bed. They were pretty bad. So I've been waiting the whole time thinking like, surely sooner or later it's gonna happen. Now it actually didn't for a long time, so you could feel like, oh, maybe it never will, but that's all I feel like happened this tournament. Somehow it came together. They're only winning on CT side at the moment. They're not having fantastic performances on T side, so I think they've still got a lot of flaws, and I think at the moment you're just seeing what the roster is capable of. Whereas when you go over to NIP and Virtus Pro, like NIP, I feel like it's almost unfair to suggest that they would be bad, because all we've seen from those online games was doing very, very well. And then they had IM Katowice, which they did pretty well considering they were in like the group of death that was very, very tough. They still did a solid performance, and that was the only land we'd seen with Pitt. And then obviously at the major, I don't really count that because they had to use threat, you know. I mean, fair play, they still made it to the round of 8, so we were still really waiting to see what can happen with them here. So I think they're a decent team. I'm still not quite sure where the ceiling is. Like I'm not quite convinced by that move. Not just because of Pitt, but because I think they had more issues in terms of like, I don't think their stars are as good as some of the stars from other teams. So in terms of firepower, they have issues. The interesting team to me is Virtus Pro, because actually I think that their slump, they're definitely in a slump. But they have a very unique type of slump, because they're the only slump I've ever seen where a team is terrible online and then actually still good on LAN. Like that's what's weird. Every LAN they've been to now, they've been good. So people often think, right, the first point where we noticed the slump was DreamHack Open Leipzig, and at this tournament they went out in the group stage. But what people don't notice, totally inexplicably, they let Mousesports have Dust 2, which is Virtus Pro's permaban, and one of the best maps for Mousesports. So they lost that one. I mean, there's an obvious reason why that is. I mean, when you've got a really deep map pool like Virtus Pro, why are you messing around like that? For whatever reasons, they lose that one. And then what cost them in the decider, it was a best of 3 against Dignitas. Kirby went crazy, and even then, the third map was like an overtime game. So that's not like a terrible performance. It's not like they just got rocked out 16-2 in both maps. So that was the bad LAN. And ever since then, they're making the playoffs of all the LANs. They can at least sometimes play teams close. They played Navi pretty close at Counter Pit. So I just feel like with Virtus Pro, I don't know what's going on with them online, but on LAN, I actually feel like they are a known quantity. They'll always turn up and play, and you have to be a really good team and beat them outright. So I actually think NiP in the match when they play today are going to really, really have a tough time there, because Virtus Pro, I mean, they have a lot of the old qualities and a lot of the old style that I thought made them one of the best teams of all time.
Okay. Just quickly jumping back to EnVyUs, obviously they did make a roster change a little while ago. They brought in Devil and took out Kiyoshima. A lot of people kind of questioning that, whether it was the right move to make, and whether a roster change was really the solution they needed to their problems. Maybe it is. Have you seen they've performed a little bit better here? Do you think that roster change is going to achieve much in the long run, or do you think it's kind of a core problem with EnVyUs?
No, but here's the thing. When they made the roster move, I think it was the right move to make on one part. Like Kiyoshima was playing terribly. Anyone who's like, oh, EnVyUs is playing well, maybe they got motivation from that, he left, whatever. They couldn't fix it in EnVyUs, so that was the right move. He was playing very poorly. Then the question becomes, do you recruit Devil to the team? Now, from his performances so far, been very mediocre, I think. But since essentially the team was already capable of winning events and top placing with Kiyoshima playing poorly, I don't think it's a problem to just have somebody who also comes in, doesn't do that well, and he's just doing the same thing. It's more on the other players. So to me, the core problems of EnVyUs lie elsewhere. But you can certainly say that this roster move didn't change anything for the better. Like, it didn't reignite them. I notice now they've conveniently started calling Devil the support player in the team, when essentially he's just not a good player in the team. I mean, I don't know why you would even like try and spin it that way, because if you remember when EnVyUs was doing really well, it was actually NBK who was the support player, and he was fantastic at that role. And in theory, you wanted Kiyoshima to work with Apex as an entry fragger. So actually, even in terms of the roles, you'd want to go back to that if you could, if you had your choice of what to do. And so if you're picking up a player, I'm sure they thought Devil was going to be a skilled player, and they probably hoped this would happen, and then he could actually be an entry fragger with him, and then they wouldn't have to label him a support player. So I think that's actually a really worrying sign that they've even had to kind of like hide the new player, just because I think in a weird way, I think it's almost like the shame of knowing like it didn't change anything and realizing it's them who's at fault. They don't want to admit it and just kick him out of the team. And also, just as like a final indignity, it turns out that G2 got another player from the same team, and that guy's actually been performing pretty well, even though G2 is terrible. So they might have even made the wrong choice there. If they had the receipt still for Devil, I think they'd go back and they'd trade him in for body, cash converse, and they'd get him out there. Probably need a few like CDs or something as well, because G2 will want to hang on to him. But no, I don't think the Devil move did much, unfortunately. But it's not a core problem of EnVyUs. If they're going to be a good team, they probably can still be good with him. They've got so much talent, but it certainly didn't help matters.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned G2 towards the end there, because I was going to ask you earlier, but I forgot. The obviously existence removed from the team, and I think it's Shox now in-game leading, which I feel like that's something you've spoken about in the past and something you're quite heavily against, right? Shox. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Shox being the in-game leader of G2, removing existence.
See, the problem with this is it's actually happened before. When he left Titan in about, I think it was like May of 2014, he went to the team that was Epsilon, and it was him and Kiyoshima and then a few other people who won't actually be remembered nowadays because they're not really in the top end of the scene. And he became the in-game leader, and the problem was, not only was he kind of like a very average in-game leader, but to become the in-game leader, he actually sort of like sublimated his whole game into trying to be like a team player. And so you took one of the best individual players in the world, and you had him doing stuff like AWPing on CT side of Inferno, in like positions he didn't normally even play, and he just essentially limited his own game. He like neutralized himself, and his team wasn't that good either, so they were never going to win tournaments. So it feels like that whole experiment, I mean, maybe it could work in the short term, like maybe it's not that bad if you have a new group of players to play this loose style, but I can't see how in the long run it's going to have a higher ceiling of success than with the existence lineup. And actually this has been a problem Shox has had his whole career. Basically, for most of the periods of his career, he's played with someone else is the in-game leader. So Existence for a long time in Source, and then now in CSGO, and then Happy obviously when he moved over to LDLC EnVyUs. And it feels like Shox is the guy where he wants to do his own style, but if you're winning, he'll be like, okay, yeah, I'll do like the things I'm supposed to do, and like it's my job, but the second you start losing, that's when he'll try and assert himself and be like, we're not working, so we're going to play my style now. And essentially that's what he tried to do in EnVyUs. He tried to wrest control, and he actually wanted Happy kicked out the team. Now, on that level, I agree with him. He might actually have been a bit prescient there. We saw that was a flaw in themselves, and they did change Happy as the in-game leader, but the downside, I think, of that is it shows that Shox has a mentality where he kind of wants everything to run through him, and he wants it to be his way. Whereas I think, from my perspective, in both of the teams where he was really good, when he had Happy as his in-game leader and Existence, it was actually like the creative tension between the two that really manifested a really good team. Because whenever you have two people who have different philosophies, but they both sort of work together, I find what happens is, rather than each person being allowed to go to some really indulgent extreme, you have to sort of find which parts you do agree on. And the parts you do agree on is what you're going to do. And then because if two smart people think of a plan and you can agree upon it, it's probably a pretty good plan. Whereas one person might have an idea of what they want to do, and who knows, maybe that's a bit off the wall, or it's too much only him that can do it, So I feel like for Shox, this might be a very dark period because his team isn't very good skill-wise. I don't know where they're going to get better players unless EnVyUs kick players, and now he's basically stuck being the in-game leader because I also don't know who else could do the role. Like you look at the rest of the players, Scream's not a very cerebral player. RPK, I don't even know if he talks. Like he just seems like a bot. Body's the brand new player, so he's not going to have the confidence, and then Smith's kind of in like an emotional down. In fact, actually, when I think of it, that might even be the solution. Supposedly, in the old Very Games lineups, Smiths used to like work with Existence to make the tactics. So if I was Shox, I'd be getting that guy on board. Let's work together on this, not just me doing it. But the thing about G2 is that Shox's birthday party, and he's allowed to cry if he wants to.
Okay, well, we'll see how they do moving forward. Anyway, we'll get towards the tournament now. Obviously, we don't know what all the semi-finals are. We know one of them. That's happening tomorrow, Envy and Na'Vi, with Guardian back, of course. And I want to kind of get your thoughts on, which team you think is going to come out the winner. I know you said on the desk earlier that you think Na'Vi is a very strong contender. Yeah. Obviously, Luminosity fell out in the group stage as well. So, are you sticking with your Na'Vi prediction at the moment, or do you see maybe NIP causing an upset, or VP causing an upset?
No, I think Na'Vi's going to win the whole tournament because you look at them, even with the problems they had with Guardian, which, as far as we can tell, may actually be exaggerated by the way that game ended, with Guardian basically just like shutting the whole server down and sending everyone home. I mean, even if Guardian isn't at full strength, this will sound strange, but them losing the major with Guardian having all those injury problems and still almost winning the first map and potentially looking good against Luminosity, actually I thought was a really positive sign. It shows like what an incredible team this is. They can play nearly all the maps in the map pool. Essentially, the only teams who have a chance to beat them are people who are really good on Inferno, because they will always ban cash, so you have to be able to pick Inferno and beat them on it. So, okay, it's true, EnVyUs has a chance there. VP, unfortunately, not as much, because VP themselves struggle on Inferno a bit. NIP would be interesting, certainly, if they got there. So I feel like they're just so well-rounded in terms of maps. They're actually showing us with Guardian's weaknesses that Seized can carry games. Edward every now and then can just go completely crazy. So the firepower and the depth in the team is insane. They're probably the only team I can think of where the superstar can get injured and that they can still win a series. So I think you look how well-rounded they are, it's going to be hard for anyone to beat them, and especially EnVyUs, because like I say, EnVyUs did it all today with just individual skill. Well, that's going to narrow it down really fast when it comes to the Na'Vi guys, because you're not going to have that differential between you and someone like Config who's having a big problem in the playoffs, you know. So then you're going to have to be able to win T rounds, and EnVyUs hasn't really shown me that. So at the moment, unless we see some like miracle Virtus Pro run where they come back in transcendent form and they can beat Na'Vi on train and these maps, I think it's probably going to be Na'Vi. And it might sound like a boring answer, but just because they're the best team here.
Okay, and final question before we end things. There's been something kind of going around saying like that this tournament will have a bit of an asterisk on it for the winner, because obviously Fnatic, they aren't in attendance because of Olaf Meister, Guardian's got injuries, and there's after the major people maybe not trying as hard or whatever. Do you agree with that kind of sentiment, that there will be like an asterisk on the winner for this, or is it just, you know, they deserve the win, they win?
I mean, there will be, in as much as it's actually a flaw, I think, of the way we think of tournaments, that every tournament isn't like you just look at the results and then assume whoever won was the best and they probably were always destined to win, and whoever like went out last, you know, they're obviously really bad. For every tournament, you should try and figure out what the context was. Like, what were the circumstances of the team coming in? Did they have any practice? Did they come straight from another tournament? Did they lose a game there? Is the team they're playing someone who's actually like fresh? For example, like Tyler, no one knows anything about them. You should really put in the context to every match. But it's true in this particular instance, whoever wins the tournament, you will have to kind of say, well, you know, Fnatic was beating everyone when Olaf Meister was in full form. We've actually never seen them really get wrecked when they had Olaf Meister in full form deep in a playoff run. It was obviously only the major where they lost, and we know the storyline there. Then you have to factor in, like, I actually think it's not so much the Na'Vi Fnatic one that's important here, it's being so soon after the major. Like, I look at the trend of the teams that lost, and the teams that lost were nearly all the teams who went to the major, haven't had any time to really practice, maybe a day or two, probably haven't had any break, just come here hoping to pick up some quick cash as well, doing all the same stuff. And then the teams that are getting the upsets didn't go to the majors, probably watched the major, know all the things about how that team play, and crucially are like less well known, or teams that wouldn't have qualified for the major, therefore they have like the mystery factor. So I think if you put all of that together in like a big gumbo pot, that's probably how you end up with this sort of a tournament. So to a degree there will be an asterisk, but it's like I said when Luminosity won the major. If Olaf Meister really has some like debilitating injury that means he has to take months off, if Guardian turns out to be like, you know, only the same player for one map here and there, maybe these players never come back to full strength. So in that scenario, that is just reality now, that those teams aren't on top anymore. So I think, unfortunately, I think for these teams that win these tournaments now, this one and the next couple, it'll only be a problem if in like 3 months both of those players come back and then they're wrecking everyone again. Then everyone will say, yeah, you won, you were the best, but only because those guys were gone.